So I'm Martin Kohler. I'm from Hamburg. I work there at the Hafen City University for architecture, urban planning, and civil engineering. I do have a course there for urban photography, by example, in streets and culture. So these are some things where you see already a kind of a professional connection between Susanna and me. And I was wondering what of these kind of diverse projects that I had in the last years and that could contribute, because they connect very well to, which of them could connect to the affordances concept and the idea of seeing streets and space as something that is basically, I mean, coming from the individual perspective of the user, of the street space user. And I do have some project that might have also lined up very well. So by example, we did a big survey on how people actually contribute or appropriate spaces of a large urban project in Hamburg, the Hafen City. That was basically done with 6 professional photographers working with methods of ethnography, and also about the thick descriptions that I read in your slides as a way to understand how people really behave in these spaces, apart from, including the subtle changes of a pose, of a gesture, of something like a wrinkle of your eye that gives you a clue on how people relate, especially with feelings, but also with more practical things like uses towards spatial settings. So that would have been one thing that I could have contributed, but I think that was too easy, it would just double. So we decided to do something else. I have a big project, it's called Big Urban Walks. It's the crazy idea to just walk from one end of the city to the other end of the city, which is absolutely easy to do in Prague, but a little bit less so if you consider spaces like Seoul or Istanbul, which have 20 million people. But I do think that they are quite interesting, and I have done that for a couple of streets, and I would like to share with you some of the basic thoughts of why I'm doing this and some of the probable outcomes that it have. And then at the end, I try to, with one slide, try to make a connection to your presentation. So Big Urban Walks is actually what is it? It's I try to summarize it in a couple of short sentences. On new ways to explore and analyze large metropolitan agglomeration based on perceived, so not on the geographical imagination, but on the perceptual level of the people who are actually using and producing city. The method is a kind of a mixed method, and uses also artistic concepts as well as ethnographical and geographical concepts. And the reef is probably one thing that I just tap it because they're just touch the concept for a short moment later. What is this large urban agglomeration? And this is only a list of some of the largest urban agglomerations we have on the world, and probably there's one number that most people know nowadays, that since around 2008, more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities. They do live in large urban agglomerations, so this is something where a lot of the human population will just say that as their home, as their normal environment, and so probably we have to deal with these cities, especially as they grew much to sizes like the agglomeration of Tokyo, with almost 30 million people living in one spot. And this is something that is radically different to places like the middle towns or the rural areas where in former times most of our world's population lived. So if you look at these numbers, then you can understand, I mean, Mexico City 20 million, Seoul 20 million, New York 19, Mumbai 19, Jakarta 19, 20 million people are living in one large plot of something. I mean, it's almost a country. How can you describe that? And if you look at the photographic plane, at how these huge spaces, especially these spaces in the big cities in the global south, are described, then you have usually 2 narratives. The one is, like I try to visualize it with pictures, the one is the city of the place of hope, of global progress, of emancipation of the individual from his traditional past into something of a modern future. So this is a picture for Edward Budninsky, Highway number 9. It's the city, well, you can see here Los Angeles, and that's how we picture city, as an immense and glimmering a factor where that attracts people. It's a magnet, it's a hotspot of lots of opportunities that you're having when you're coming to these big cities. Experience that you do not have anywhere else. Things that really kind of change your life. So this is one of the big narratives, and the other is actually just the opposite. It's a city as well, lack of hope, lack of perspective, incredible poverty, incredible injustice in terms of environmental but also economical conditions, places where people have to live in these shacks, and the river is actually dried up and completely filled up with trash, with rubbish and trash. So this is the other part of the big narrative of the metropolitan areas. And if you look at these places, then, well, also in the kind of geographical descriptions, you read a lot about disorder, about monsters, about some kind of complex areas that became, well, have pockets of poverty and, well, less perspective. It's something where you can just kind of really sense with every word of the urban, well, of the authors of these lines, that they somehow lost control, lost to grasp or capture that, well, that complex system, the systems of large urban agglomerations, and trying to find, regain a certain form of control in terms of visualizing this project. And the interesting part is actually that we had these kind of descriptions already, well, around 50 or 60 years ago, actually even a little bit further, 80 years ago, after the Industrial Revolution, when suddenly places like London also grew immensely. And there it was also kind of a dislocation of the perspective based from, that was usually based on street level, and raising the planner up to that he could take into view, well, this is a place in I think in Paris, where he starts to make sense out of this grid, this layout of grids and roads again, and suddenly discovers something like a form or shape that he could comprehend. And so in 1920, this is aircraft book from Le Corbusier that he wrote or published in 1935, where you could also see this. Well, actually, he's describing he's describing his first flights with the airplane or the balloon over places like Paris and Rio de Janeiro, where he suddenly says, "Wow, now I can comprehend, now I can understand the city again." So it was this kind of the city of the Industrial Revolution became too complex, too huge, too strange, so that after a while, even the urban planners could not understand what this monstrum, what this mechanism is actually, well, what shape it has and how it looks like. And with the elevation of the planner from done with the technological device of an airplane, suddenly they could comprehend the city again and say, well, now we are able to work with it. But that was 80 years ago, and if you look at this list again, then suddenly you see something, well, first the numbers are much, much bigger. So London at that time had around 8 million people, now it has 19. If you look at the spaces, so Tokyo, Seoul, Mexico City, New York, Mumbai, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, Delhi, Osaka, Shanghai, Manila, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, probably none, despite, well, New York, none of these places have been on the list just 20 years ago. So we have a rise of these urban agglomerations, especially in the kind of sheer numbers that are much more in the urban, in the global south. And they grew even bigger than the kind of tiny, almost tiny and cute London of 1920. So maybe we are now in a position where we should kind of try to find another way, or well, new ways to understand and to analyze these large urban agglomerations. And I think, well, this is my proposal, that based on the kind of anthropological space, the space that you can, well, reach by walking, might be one way. So if you talk about places like Sao Paulo, where we have the same description, like a kind of a city that you can't control anymore, maybe it's also because we are looking from so far away on the city that we really simply do not see any spaces anymore. And I made a rough calculation. If you want to if you want to print out a satellite map of Sao Paulo with its recent, it's his surface in a scale from 1 to 5,000, which is kind of, well, a scale where you can hardly see some of the spaces, you would have a map that is 80 meters long and 60 meters broad. I mean, this is just, it's of course a metaphor, but just makes clear that it's probably not possible to elevate anymore. Now we have to kind of try to dig into the street spaces, especially because I think they will tell you much more about the kind of the qualities and well, specificnesses of different cities, and that's why that's what I speculate upon, and that's why I'm doing this walk through the big cities. So, but first I would like to talk a little bit about walking, and or not only about walking, but about two artists that use walking quite a lot in order to understand a social and spatial configuration. One of them is Akinbodi Akinbi. He's a photographer from Lagos. Actually, he was well. His method is actually kind of a rambling. He's just kind of taking his camera and then he's rambling around in any of the places in Lagos that he knows, and he's just kind of like at the reef, walking from one hand side to the other, and then digging into some courtyards and following a person. So it's not scientifically in terms of that he has a concept which is kind of like a like a transect or something. He's just getting impressed by the city, and in terms of what he takes pictures of and how he writes down some notes, which are basically a kind of the soundscape that he writes down. It's like that he echoes the city, how it is revealed to him. And with this, he started a project. I mean, here all roads, a project where he started to analyze and evaluate all the big African cities, well, not only Lagos, but Johannesburg, Cape Town, and further, to come up with a kind of a description of these cities that are different to, well, the Western urban thinkers, from people like architects like Kohler, who came to Lagos, and because he did not understand the city, he just kind of formed the theory of the congestion and of a kind of a city that works despite the fact that it cannot work, which is, my understanding, a kind of a European misunderstanding of that place. And so Akinbodi works on an emancipatory project where he said, well, with my pictures, my photographs, and the way how I experience these places, I can can come up with a different account on African city that has not the urban theory of the European thinkers of the last 100 years. Another person that I would like to propose to present to you is Michael Höpfner, and because it's not only a kind of a one-way direction lecture, you also should kind of do something. So now we try to read aloud the text that I have in German under the photos. Anybody understands German? I mean, except of me, of course. Oh, so I'm your entrance point into these quotes. Michael Höpfner is an Austrian. He's an artist, and he got fascinated very much by the Chinese, well, some of the deserted places of in China, where you do have a lot of tribes, and especially nomadic tribes. And in his travels, he was always kind of fascinated how they work, or how they kind of react to the influence and the progress of the Chinese modern times, especially in terms of infrastructure, but also of traditions and certain cultural values. And he started to kind of analyze these impacts by not going straight to the nomadic villages and talk to people, which would have been probably the approach of a social researcher, because he said, no, they are kind of inscribed and embedded in a network of, well, environmental but also cultural artifacts that I cannot see if I just go straight to their village. So he started to walk from kind of a modern city center in China and walk for 2, 3, 4 weeks through the desert to approach these villages. And by this way of walking around and taking pictures, he said, well, in his opinion, it gives him a deep understanding of the places, of the changes of the different environments, and how it comes from the modern Chinese town to these nomadic villages. And he says something, so to go on foot or to walk on foot is a kind of a try and attempt to go beyond my used perceptual patterns. So it's not, I'm not looking like I used to look before when I'm walking. It's a kind of concentrated position that enables me to get confronted by a formerly unknown environment and culture of people. And well, that's why I think it's a very good tool to understand and analyze a still changing environment. And you could say, well, these are only artists, so why artists are using, that they are using photography and that they are using walking is something which is, of course, well, kind of really easily understandable, because art means you're free to choose your tools and you're free to choose what you are approaching to. So if somebody says, well, walking for me is something which gives me a good source of understanding the city, then, well, he can do that. That's why it's art. But if you look at this woman, Jane Jacobs, hallmark. Everybody knows Jane Jacobs? No? Well, you're not urban planners, aren't you? Because otherwise, everybody's like, oh, the old lady. Jane Jacobs wrote in 1963, I guess, a very crucial book on urban planning. It's called Life and Death of the Great American Cities. And she was kind of challenging this is Blenner's ideal of Robert Moses from New York and well, the big developers of a city that can be planned and that is barely more than the kind of the plan applied and implemented into reality. And she made a book on where she actually promoted the first time the importance of sidewalks, by example, of normal street life. So that, where she actually said something like this, what you developed much further with the in-between spaces, that actually the sidewalks are the places where people meet. That is something that is mostly important for inhabitants of cities. And it's not the park, and it's not so much the residential area, it's all the things that are not on the plan of urban planners. And actually she got these insights very much because she was working as journalist for the big developers, so she knew the big projects, but also because she walked around in these areas for well, ages. And so this combination of the plans, knowing about the plans and knowing about the kind of, well, getting exposed to the city by walking was something that brought her to, well, write this very crucial book that is still valid and is still cited, at least in urban planning and urban design terms. So I do think walking is a very good way to understand the city. And walking is also a very good way to challenge the notion of a city. So this is also a very famous map. You should remember. Anybody knows this map? Ah, come on, international situationists. Guy Debord. Under the street, there's the beach. Nobody knows the slogan? Ah, damn it. All right, that was actually, there was a bunch of bastards in Paris that had nothing to do than just drink a lot and hang around with his friends and say, well, government is one of the most stupid institutions that we ever had. So it started as as an art group, but it especially challenged very much our notion of the city and of the society. And it became very important because it sparked, or it formulated some of the basic ideas that came to the '68 protest and revolution in Paris, but well in other places. And it is kind of rediscovered in recent years because they also promote walking. So, by example, Guy Debord and his Psychogéographique de Paris is actually something where he was walking with his friends all over Paris, I mean the inner parts of Paris, and then he started to kind of tear apart the official map of Paris, and this is of course a kind of very political, you know, the government comes up with a map and then you, this is not true, this is not my Paris. This is the Paris of the mayor, or maybe the Paris of the big planners, but not my Paris. And so he kind of tore apart the official map, and then he said, well, actually, because of my walking, because of my walking with friends, and how we kind of how we saw certain characteristics, how we talked to people, what kind of people we actually met on the street, I would say this is kind of a patch that has something in common. This is a characteristic. It's a neighborhood, we would say, as urban planners, and this one is too, and there's also one. And maybe here, no, this is not a neighborhood. This has no impression, so he just left the piece away. And so he said, well, these are my entireties. That's the way how the city kind of is perceived. And there are connections between, but not everywhere where I have a street, but only on some connection. I can see them. So here we have, because that's the gate, or the kind of the head towards the Seine. This is a very important place. It has many connections to all of the different patches, and some of them here are kind of completely isolated. So he started to kind of analyze by walking, by talking with friends about the city and about how they kind of, well, perceive the city, how actually their Paris is. And of course, this is a map, and it's a map that is shown in museums. It's art. So you could again say, well, nice, but it does not help us in terms of a kind of a scientific or geographically fund or valid understanding of the city. But I do think there is a certain similarity with another famous map, which is from Kevin Lynch and The Image of the City. Another author you might have not heard about yet. No? Ah, The Image of a City, another crucial. Actually, he said the first time when that in terms of understanding of cities, we do not kind of pretend to use a plan. It's more like stories, that we see certain things like landmarks or edges, borders, boundaries. So many of I think many of your categories from last time are coming from Kevin Lynch, where he said actually he did hundreds of interviews with people of Boston, asked them, so how, in the end actually he asked them to describe their way back home or their way to certain places in Boston, and they made some sketches, and then he tried to compile these sketches in the interview and to find out how people actually remember spatial configurations like cities. And there he came to Boston, by example, a map like here, where he said, well, you have patches, so fields, you have certain boundaries and edges, and you have hotspots, places where it could be traffic, a traffic hub, or maybe something like well, a social space where you meet a lot of people. And that's the way how people remember a city. And I do think that is also like, I mean, here is some Boston, but it does not show up on the map. So if we go back to Paris, also there's some Paris, but it does not show up on the map. And you have the connections that are not only where the street is, but also where this possible connection of a street is actually enacted. And so that's why I think that these two maps are not so far away from each other. And well, the map of Kevin Lynch is actually absolutely accepted. Everybody's using it. And it's also quite intriguing that nobody wrote a book that is kind of a follow-up of Kevin Lynch's idea or image of a city. So it's still valid despite the fact that it's only 50 or almost 50 years old now. The interesting part is that we come up to, well, with all these different examples, we are coming to a conclusion that is, well, not formulated by me for the first time. It's actually here from Children Rose already, that the geographical imagination that you can comprehend everything well, on a map or in a geographical abstraction that is usually a map is only an illusion. And Lefebvre said something, an illusion of transparency. Because looking at the map and looking at our satellite data, we do not have even the idea that this map misses a lot of things, and especially not only because it's not kind of symbolized, but also when you go back to these spaces, because they are not, I mean, they can't be shown in a kind of a Cartesian coordinate system, because sometimes there are spatial distances, that is the basis of maps, that have no correlation to the social understanding of these spaces. Sometimes you even have the same space or different spaces on the same geographical entirety, like a kind of, well, probably one of your, well, the Wenzel Square, to give you an example of Prague. I mean, if you ask 500 people, the tourists and maybe some people from Prague, then probably you will have description of 4 different places. But still, they are on the same geographical kind of plot. And that is something that we completely miss if you look on maps as the kind of the, you know, the most valid source of information for spatial planning. And so this walking actually goes also with kind of, well, trying to find different maps, different ways to pictorialize and visualize and also analyze the urban agglomerations. I skipped this one because that was, well, was very interesting, but it's just another name you haven't heard about yet. But the person from Francesco Carrieri wrote a book on walkscapes where he actually tried to understand the environmental system, especially cities are based on walking, and his idea is that actually by walking we are creating routes, and by walking we are creating environments, and by, well, the whole population walking somehow, we are actually creating the system that we call a city. And then he tried to kind of figure out and trace it back to, say, a certain cultural well, certain different cultures. It was really digging very deep into architectural history. And he said something that the term path has actually a threefold meaning, and the path is something that we connect with walking. So at first it's a kind of an action. The action to go from one place to the other place, and this action will reveal something and will make you, well, it will kind of set your mental condition that you use to perceive the next spot that you see. So it makes a difference from which side you are coming to the public square, because depending what you've perceived there before, it will influence what you will see there on the square. So this action is very important, and it creates something. So because I walk, some people can react to me. They can talk, or they can beat me if they like. The second dimension is that the path in itself is an architectural object, which is, I mean, there's sometimes some art projects that are quite funny. How can you create a wall, or kind of how can you block a street just by people? And it's not standing there, it's just using a pedestrian pathway and have 10 people and all the time going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And because there is a traffic law that you can't run over people if they are on the pedestrian pathway, so the cars have to stop. So basically you're actually just kind of, you build something like a wall. That's what's meant with this walking, and that you can kind of, well, that you have an object in between. And the last, and that is actually the very interesting part, that a path is a narrative structure. If you talk about somebody, or if somebody talks about the walk he has done, then he gives you an account, he gives you a story. And this story is something that you can pretend and you can re-understand because it's based on certain places that you know, and it has a certain chronological order. But it is basically a story. And if you could look back at some of these big city issues and about the map as something that has a certain illusion of transparency, especially the example of the Václav Square that I gave you, maybe stories and, well, this narrative accounts and cities are in certain cases more capable of really grasping the wholeness of a city than a map that tries to kind of flat it down to one plane that is equal to each of us. So I use this for finally doing what I would like to present. I'm a little bit bad. Well, you're bored? No? Yeah, so I stop here. Yes, so that was a kind of the, well, providing the platform to, to understand what I actually want to present. Pictures, photographs. So I told you a little bit about this big urban walk, and now I talked a bit about the kind of, well, some of the, well, basic ideas and thoughts and concepts that I think that are, well, valid to understand the big urban walks. It's not only a kind of nonsense project, but in fact actually it started as a nonsense project. And that is Seoul, as you can easily see, right? So Seoul is basically around the Han River. The historical center is here because there was a small river that they well, recently rediscovered. It's actually quite a funny story because it's dried out, so they had to kind of pump the water now into the city to have the stream again that they just re-excavated. Around the city also, in not even 100 years, a city exploded from almost from less than 1 million people up to, in the whole region, 20 million. And that is something that is a kind of a characteristic of these cities of the Global South, that they virtually exploded. So, and there's no real urban planning that tried to, well, that was able to manage that growth. So we have a kind of a huge, large mess of something, and I used to be there for quite a while because we did some research project, and at one time I was located here in the hotel, and we wanted to go to this place, which is a new city that is well filled into the how do you say? Well, it's actually built into the sea, so they put some soil on it so that you get some construction ground. How is it called, Peter? Dredging. Huh? Dredging? Yes. So dredged land and build a city for 500,000 people, so half Prague, just in 5 years. It was incredible. But of course, we had to see that. We are tourists still as planners. So we went from here to there with a high-speed express metro line, and it took us 3 hours. I mean, in 3 hours, you can basically go from almost half, or you can pass half of Germany with a high-speed express train. So, I mean, this is not only about the city. It's not like 10 minutes to the next stop. This is actually kind of going to the end of something that is more, well, that I would more compare with a country or something. So this was my idea of Seoul. And after a while, I discovered that this transect that you can see here is actually not as, well, was something posing a question to me if that was really true with, and how could I relate that to the 3 hours with the express train. We make it, well, it's very interactive today. So we make it like a guessing game. What do you think, how long is this line? How much? 50? 200 kilometers? Yeah. I'd like to remind 20.5 million people. So we have 50, we have 200. More? Less? 10?
It says 15.
15? Oh, so between 50 and 200? The average would be roughly 110. But
I'll go for
40. 40?
70.
Not bad.
77.
Huh? Ah, now we are coming. The winner gets a banana. Now more questions. 80?
800.
800. Yes, almost. No, but I mean, of course, it's very hard because it's satellite data and if you don't know the city. But I was sitting in my hotel room and was kind of playing with Google Earth. You like this? Going into this strange shapes and where you see, there must be a very bad place. And then just suddenly I started to measure this land, this country, Seoul. And that line is actually 60 kilometers. And now this 77. My dear, you just won. Banana is yours. Yeah, the golden banana. No, I mean, for me, it posed a question because on one hand side, I imagine Seoul as such an immense place. I mean, with the 20 million people, with the 3 hours to go from the middle just to the end. And on the other hand side, it was only 60 kilometers.
It wasn't a very high-speed train.
No, it was not the straight direction. So the whole thing is 60 kilometers, and if you're walking a little bit, then you know that actually if you're doing a hiking trail somewhere, so 30 kilometers is something you could easily do. Of course, this is aerial distance, so probably you have to do some, going back and forth, and that means it will translate to 80 or maybe 110 kilometers. But just I wanted to try if that is possible, because this city, this is actually too huge for human people. So it's actually more than an individual can cross. You have to use technology like trains or cars to just kind of reach everything. It would, for me, it would be kind of a very symbolically a very interesting endeavor to say, no, actually you can walk from one side to the other. And that's why I actually did it in 2009. And I did that with some other cities afterwards, so these are all the cities that I walked so far. Istanbul was the first, Seoul was the first, there on the right-hand side. So then came Hamburg, of course, Istanbul, London, Sao Paulo, the Ruhr area, then Delhi, Hyderabad, Detroit, Las Vegas, Delhi, Hyderabad, and Buenos Aires. And the last days I walked Prague, which is almost the same. Coming back to Seoul, and now I would like to kind of share 3 well, two paths, and according to these well, quote that I just said, what the path actually is, path and action as an object, and as path as narrative structure, we are coming back to Seoul. So that is the actual route that I took, and I don't have to remind you, environmental planners. So line transect sampling is something that we use for, well, forestry, by example, to come up with representative data on something like a 2- or 3-dimensional ecosystem. So I tried to do such a transect from up there, and after 5 days, I really ended up here. And so it was not really the 2 days that I actually thought of, but in 5 days to walk through such a big city with some nice stories, I can tell you one of them, is actually quite an interesting thing. There's a question?
Yeah, real quick, was your goal just to see basically how long it took? Did you go in and try and find a straight line, or did you try to go to specific places in the city? Was any of it based on neighborhoods that you knew about, or was it just passing through the scene?
Yeah, that is a very good question. My idea about this walking was, of course, not only if it's possible to go from one hand side to the other. It was a kind of my personal project. So the basic motivation that made me walking even after 3 days and sore feet. But of course, I also thought about this. I wanted to have a kind of a city and how I can see it from a side which is not map based. So that's why I was not walking a straight line. I was just starting somewhere and trying to have a kind of, well, with the sun and some landmarks, have a rough orientation, then tried not to look at the map as much as possible. And basically, I just did it 4 or 5 times for the whole site.
So you weren't choosing known neighborhoods or famous areas to
no. No, it was kind of like a line transect. I just had I choose one point on the one side and one point on the other side. Then I talked with some experts and asked them just if it would be special to walk through here or just something. And they said, well, it would be just something. And so I tried to find that line. But as I said, kind of really getting exposed as closely as possible and as much as possible towards the city, to the people that I meet, to the architecture, to all this kind of, this phenotype of street spaces that are usually that determine my perception on the city. And so that's why we have this kind of, here on the upper path, I was starting first at a kind of a very a highway almost. And then after a while, it became very boring, so that's why I made this turn to the right-hand side, and then I came into it's a kind of very old neighborhood. That's why you have this lots of bends and curves that you can see in the GPS tracks of that point. And then I came back, tried to find my way, and what you all can easily see is a kind of how the topography plays into how you choose your route, but not only topography, but also things like being interested or becoming interested or getting bored, but also like things like feeling safe or confident or kind of threatened in a certain way, which did not happen actually in Seoul, but in other places. But so it's the way how you react to the city based on an anthropological kind of an anthropological experience. And the basic thing about this walking is that you are exposed to, and the navigation that you have to apply in these areas, because you do not know the places, is actually something that brings you also to the places of the city that you do not know. Because it's easy. As a tourist, by example, I knew Seoul very well as an urban planner and as a tourist. But every time when you look for something new, you end up with something that somebody knows, that you know, or that you know already. So in the end, you are always kind of putting together the same kind of spaces, some because they're spectacular, because they are known to people that you know, or to the person who wrote the guidebook. And by connecting these 2 points, you also kind of encounter all the spaces in between. There might be that might be too ordinary or too kind of less interesting, so that somebody would ask you to or advise you to go there. And that is something about the core of this methodology, that actually by walking through, you are paying attention to every single space on that line to the same degree. It's not like the tourist who goes to the city center basically and then to the kind of landmarks and to get impressed by the Eiffel Tower and completely forget about the rest of Paris. So that's the thing. And so it was day 1, and there was day 2, there was day 3, and this was day 4. And here's actually a kind of, there was a very interesting point that I can show you in pictures, because when I was here, it looked a bit like that. Yeah, I just liked the route, so I followed the girl, of course. There was a road going up the hill, and it was exactly my direction. I was not sure about this, about the road, but it looked somehow promising. It was after kind of a very ordinary neighborhood that where I became bored, more or less. So I was just walking up the hill, just to find out after a while that it had led me to a military base or something. Of course, with a fence and a guard who said, well, you're not allowed to be here, go back. And the problem was now that I didn't want to go back because I was walking already for 4 hours, and just to come up to this point, what took me almost 1 hour. So just going back the 1 hour and then make the huge detour around this green patch was something I was not so very fond of, obviously. That's why I tried to find a way around this military base. And actually, I found many ways. So it was very easy. So if you have the fence there, then you just have to turn right, and then you walked along the fence, and suddenly the fence was gone, and suddenly you're in the midst of nature. It was wonderful. It was very, very scenic. And I was not the first one. As you can see here, there's a trodden path, an elephant path. And when entering into this, I mean, it was on a hillside, entering into this little forest, suddenly I discovered hundreds of these paths. And actually, I was not the only one. As you can see here, it was used as a kind of, like a park. I met, in the first 20 minutes, I met at least 10 groups of people, usually, 50-year-old Korean women, dressed up with all this functional wear of the racing suit, this is bright colors, everything closed, sunglasses, even some kind of a hat and scarf around the mouth. So it was not like getting exposed to nature. It was kind of closing down to nature. But on the other hand side, all of them enjoyed this walking around in this forest. And as I said, I mean, we had to walk 1 hour up to this road, and then because I didn't want to go back, I went around, and it was not kind of a very strange place where I was, going into the unknown areas of the city. Actually, it was already made up by the people just by walking through as a kind of a park. So I felt safe. I think it was wonderful. We had stunning views of the whole Seoul. I love to have this discovery of a place in Seoul that was so nice. I chatted with some of the people, and I went further, and I started to see things like this. And that was actually quite interesting because after a while I realized after another hour that suddenly there are not so many people around me anymore. In fact, there was nobody anymore. And I passed something like this barbed wire and thought nothing because I couldn't read Korean like here. And when I came to this point, it became clear why suddenly nobody was there anymore, because I saw some ditches, some strange little huts, and then some cutouts with human silhouettes somewhere there, with a little thing of the heart. And that was a moment where I realized that I just ran into the shooting field of this military base there. And I was very disappointed and actually almost angry. I mean, that was a protection. Only a barbed wire, and I could go into the military base and ending up in the shooting fields without seeing anybody. So, but the next problem was, then behind the bushes there was a little kind of a ditch and a great, like a parking lot. And there I could hear and see the around 200 soldiers that just had their lunch there. And I thought, oh, I can go back now 5 hours and go around for another 5 hours. Or I could just go through. I mean, I made a kind of a rough calculation about, risk versus efficiency. And, and then I said, well, at first I'm an unexpected problem. If I'm coming from the back of their camp and as a stupid looking European with a Che Guevara scarf and a pink bag, then They were probably kind of first trying to find out what I'm doing there. The next, probably they will stop me, and then because I can't speak Korean, they probably can't speak English. So after, let's say, I was roughly calculating, after 3 hours maybe, they will just throw me out of the camp, and which saves me 2 hours because the 5 hours going around would be longer. So I said, well, of course, I hit the camera, and then I was walking, was continuing my walk, and I went through these people, and it was so amazing. It was really amazing. I mean, I expected something like, what are you doing here? But in the end, I was coming down this embankment, and I went walking like you. One of the soldiers sitting here having his pot, and walking through and saying, hey, sorry, can I here? I was going through, and nobody stopped me. And actually, nobody even noticed me. I had this feeling. I was really walking through these 200 soldiers, and nobody watched at me. The only one who did it was kind of looking straight to his pot again. And so I continued, and I went to came back to the normal road and went towards the gate, and a patrol of soldiers came, and the one said, I didn't try because then you would have recognized that I'm not belonging to the military base. And really the first person who reacted to me was the guard at the entrance, because he had the kind of a rule. All the others, for them, I was just a problem that they didn't have any guidelines. They did not have a kind of a common reaction that they could apply. I was not supposed to be there. That's why I could just walk through. And the first person who had something like a rule was the guard, but unfortunately his rule was for people coming in, not for people going out. That's why. That's why he kind of hesitated, and I was through, and whoop, and then I was back in the city. It was really incredible. I mean, of course, it's kind of a perfect story to tell. But how this kind of action, how much it reveals about the social and the cultural structure of that place. So first about these military bases, how they occupy a certain part of the city, how it creates a kind of a buffer zone around that got used in that case by some people, kind of establishing a landscape park just by themselves, and then also about the military, about the certain rules of people and organization. Of course, there was military, but in the end, it's very much the same when you walk in another neighborhood. Also, you will meet there are people that have a certain kind of normal rules, how they behave to each other, how they behave to foreigners, and by walking through, you will kind of you will see and you will experience them, and by thus, I think it will tell you a great many deal more about the street space and streetwiseness, probably coming back to our title, than just by looking on a map and looking, making an appointment with the officer of the military base and getting a kind of presentation or a walkthrough and visit to this guy. So, and this is just a kind of the most fun to tell story, but very similar stories I have experienced all over the world. So that's the action. We're coming to the path as an object. It's very close. Whenever I walk these big cities, I have two types of photographs that I'm taking. The one is actually everything that I'm interested in. And the second is once in a while, so every time when I see that there's something changing in the environment, I take one picture that is straight, that is exactly my position, my perspective at the moment as a walker. And you can put them together into something that I call, oops, is it this? No, it's the other. Walk-through videos. So that's a crossing animation of Sao Paulo. I started in Peru. And so, like this some flip books. So I stop here. This is one of the movies that I have from almost all of my walks, and some of them are available on Vimeo, where you can walk in 10 minutes Sao Paulo. That saves you around 1,000 euros. If you want to fly over and walk the 5 days, it also saves you 5 days, because in 10 minutes you can walk with me through Sao Paulo. Woohoo! If you want to do that alone. And you can do that also in London. If you like, you can do that in 2 windows on your computer at the same time. And then it becomes interesting, because suddenly as you have seen here, Sao Paulo is known as a city of skyscrapers. It has more skyscrapers than New York. And I have lots of pictures from one of the highest buildings in the city center, where you don't see a horizon anymore. Up to the horizon, everything is full of skyscrapers. And then, if you compare that with these pictures, how long do you have to go, and without seeing any skyscraper? Because actually, still 80% of the population in Sao Paulo lives in these 2-story shacks. So the architecture is actually quite shallow. It's very rural. It's very, very fresh, because Sao Paulo is also a city that grew from 60,000 people in 1900 to 20 million nowadays. So that is something where you can see this walking through reveals you something of the structure, and especially more based or more prominent, more focusing on the peripheries and the in-between spaces between periphery and center. And I've done some serious research with photographic, photo-based interviews using such pictures from walks to understand if, urban planners of different municipalities, how they imagine their region that they deal with professionally. And what you can see absolutely clear is that actually everybody knows about the periphery, everybody knows about the city center, and they completely underestimate all of the time all the spaces in between, which is usually the space where 80% of their urban population lives. So this walking through such a kind of map of Sao Paulo is something that does not kind of prioritize the center and the periphery that much, but rather the things in between, and especially kind of the graduations, the transformations of one part to the other. And if you're watching this movie, then you can't see any favela, because a favela is something that you get, everybody tells you about the favela when you're coming to Brazil, but in fact it's hard to find one, because in the end they are not so super extraordinary. It's just a type of housing that has different facets, and that blends very easily into kind of proper neighborhoods that look the same or almost the same, just have a different legal constitution. They have the property ownership, which the people in the favela usually have not. And suddenly this kind of how it blends into a kind of an urban landscape, that does not mean that the favela is something extraordinary. It's just one part of a kind of a network of different spaces that gets more clear in things like that. You can, if you like, walk that by yourself. I would like to give you another, now the narrative structure, another account with almost the same pictures on the same path that we took here in Sao Paulo. So we walked actually from Perus, which is in the interior, it was less than a day actually, unto one of the 2 rivers that surround the historical center of Sao Paulo and form a kind of a natural barrier or border of the city, the center part and the outer part. And I tried to use all the other pictures, these pictures that became created by looking left and right, and just kind of by walking through, making sweeping pictures, I call them, and ordered them with a certain method of clustering pictures based on similarity. It's kind of like a phenomenological approach where you just have the pictures and you try to relate them towards each other by are they similar or not, depending on certain categories. And by thus you're coming to new types and new aggregated data where I say, this is a pile of pictures that has something in common, just based on the photographic evidence. And I did that here so here we are in Perus, which is a kind of very new neighborhood. And what you can see here is a kind of, what's very important, that in the valley, in the base, you have this self-built type of housing, and at the same time, some restoration, some modification, interventions that was done by the government. of course, along the river, because the river is the kind of the most dangerous area for these houses. As sometimes it gets flooded and it floods some houses away. So this is the area of intervention. And as you can see, also with the colors and the robustness of this design and the kind of very bare thing compared to that, I mean, what image of the governmental action stands behind of well, doing something on these sites and come out to treat people. From there, you're starting to get up the hillside, and there certainly the architecture changes. So it becomes a bit more, you know, more refined, a little bit more stable, less only this the bare stone blocks. And if you end up at the hillside, there you have usually very new houses, and also some that we would consider at least medium class or upper, well, not upper class, but medium class housing, so which is very proper and which has nothing to do with the poverty that you could have seen in the valley. From there, continuing, you're coming to this kind of in-between spaces that are between, well, this is actually around a state's highway, and there, of course, you have all the different, well, commerce and workshops that you would expect. But also this picture shows a bit more than just the notion of workshops there, but also how they kind of deal to, or how they design their space between the road and the workshop, which is actually what we call public space. And then here you have to go through, and it's also interesting, the big roads are somehow detached from the favela. So there's a favela still in the valley that I'm kind of passing parallel, but the road is more, is kind of a little bit shielded towards these settlements. And then you have the big ring, the ring of the highway around Sao Paulo, that of course separates the left-hand side, right-hand side. I mean, which is kind of like the border, like the river. This is one of these famous favelas. And as you can see, it's actually it's incredible. You have to see that picture in kind of reality, which and then it's much bigger. And you can so many little stories happening everywhere around these places. You know, on the balcony, on the roofs, on the balconies, in the street spaces. Everybody there's so many people around and dealing with each other. That's why this is the favela culture is usually associated with street life, with a kind of very dense and very rich urban environment. That's usually when we are, as European planners, came to this place and we do not see the social reality, but just this kind of very picturesque urban landscape. We really like it a lot and think, wow, that's how it should look like in our very formulated and fragmented cities. Yeah, and then here we're coming to, again, to a kind of a, well, commercial part. So the first time when we have some social housing and some state-owned housing in between, but still kind of with lots of green spaces in between, so it's not completely built up yet. And these spaces filled usually by local, well, food stalls. Then there's a kind of an older area where you find a much bigger mixture, but also much more street life. This is a church, that slanting thing. It's not slanting because the building is slanting, it's slanting because I was not holding the camera right, of course. Well, some kind of, you know, even you have the first time some pedestrian pathways. Then you're passing a green area, which is a nature reserve. So it's around the Pico de Charaguá. And after that, actually, suddenly you come into a kind of a, well, a poorer, well, apparently poorer area that suddenly shows you this, you know, these Detroit signs of burned cars and not completed or maybe already tear down buildings. And again, like a little bit too many walls that actually made the street experience. I mean, walking the street into like walking in a tunnel. Because all the time you have not windows, not shopping windows, nothing, only the walls around you. And that adds to this feeling of being threatened or seeing an unsafe place. Actually, nothing happened to me, and actually people probably have been very nice, but just this kind of there you can place together the different of the walls and the decaying condition of some of the pictures that add up to something that you feel as threatened. And go through again into this Pico de Charaguá, and you are ending up with places like that, which are, I mean, for me as a kind of an urban planner from Germany, incredible. How can you build that? Or build it from somebody? So it's everything somehow it came into an existence, like being born and being planned. And from there, suddenly you have the first skyscrapers. You're coming to Pirituba, which is one of the first hubs where two metro lines meet. So for that area, it's actually the first point on my walk where you have a kind of a proper public transport. And it's here again, I mean, the age of the architecture, but also how it combines different people, the atmosphere. Suddenly it's not this neighborhood sociability on a street, but more kind of a more urban, more public maybe environment. Also this, they made from this huge pipe car, VW microbus. And then you're coming to some older proper social housing that is considered to be very unsafe and violent. That's why the bordering parts of that neighborhood are in a process of deconstruction and of remodification. And after that, we are coming again to a kind of a proper middle-class neighborhood. In here, a few power station. And suddenly you have the whole scene becomes less residential. And finally you have these famous gated communities, the apartment houses that are so influential in Sao Paulo because everybody actually wants to have a doorman, and living in an apartment house where you have this kind of a sense of security. It's more a sense of security than an actual security. And then you are at the river. This is not the Pinheiros, the Tietê, one of the two rivers that surround the inner series of Sao Paulo. So now we actually walk the same path as we did in the video. And it's just a kind of a different way of telling these spaces and now kind of telling you something about the structure of Sao Paulo. And of course, I was giving you only a short account, but I hope that most of that was actually in the pictures, and you could kind of refine and work out these different accounts much more. So what is the use of it? So I could say, well, now I can tell you something about Sao Paulo, about Istanbul. Maybe I can give you the two videos and tell you something that you can by yourself kind of rediscover certain ways of how to relate Istanbul to London, or London and Sao Paulo, and especially Istanbul and Sao Paulo would be very, very interesting because I have seen so many similarities. But there's another thing, because I do think by this kind of breaking the city apart into in a row of situations, you're doing something that is very close to kind of modern urban theory, that actually says it's impossible to compare a whole city with another city, because a city is not an entirety. A city is a kind of a collection, an assemblage of processes that plays out with a local configuration, certain spaces, and sometimes in a very same way and sometimes completely different. And these are parts where you could kind of learn from the one city to the other city. But it's based on a situation within this network and not the city as a whole. And here is one picture that for me made it quite not clear, but is a kind of an indicator for this thing. It is I hope you agree with me that this is a kind of a very similar situation. The picture is, you have these huge newer blocks, then on the top of the hill you have a kind of normal architecture, much smaller than in the middle parts. You have, what you do not see here is actually the river, and around the river you have some precarious housing. You have different ages, so the middle parts are usually oldest, and the precarious housing is the next, and the one, the big, here it's this apartment, there it's another type of apartment, it's still very striking, similar, is the newest. And the one is in Istanbul and the other is in Sao Paulo. But both are in this, are not in the central area, more in some of these newly developed places. And in the end, actually, they show something very remarkably different. This is similar. This is a build and sell type housing. That's how they're called, and which is more or less the same as we can see here. It's a process of how urbanization was, actually kind of physically performed by landowners, or not yet landowners, who just started to build into the agricultural parts of this well, huge metropole, started to build a first house. And then after a while, when the whole process of urbanization flushed over these areas, suddenly there was a demand for more housing. And the local, the apartment or the house owners partnered with some local builders, local developers that they did not have any money, but they had the capacity to build. So they partnered up and said, well, give me your house, especially the plot of land. We tear down the house. I can build a new type, a new house which has around 4 to 5 stories, and then we share. You get half of the apartments, and I get the other half of the apartments. The basic idea is that there's no money involved. You do not need any government, and it's just the two people, so local builders and well, individual house owners. And that is actually a process that you have there as well as here. That's one of these international, this globalized process of housing production that you can find in Istanbul and Sao Paulo. And it's also inscribed in a process of, layered by another process, which is what you can see with the apartments. Because then after a while, when this region becomes, or this part of the city becomes kind of well known, and the city scatters around it, then suddenly it becomes so prominent and probably so expensive that the big developers, so the national or international developers, started to discover these areas, and then they start to kind of build also. But they go to the top of the hill, what these build-and-sell type houses never did, because it's too it's just not cost effective enough, because you have to bring all the materials up to the hill. You have to install the water infrastructure, all that stuff that you do not want to do if you're a local developer. But if you're a big developer, then it doesn't make, then this is not a restriction to you. So they started to build the huge apartments on the top of the hill, which is also the same process that we can see then in Istanbul and Sao Paulo. And so this is actually the idea of this, why walking or by looking at certain situations rather than on the whole of a city actually makes a lot of sense in terms of learning how certain processes of economy, of environment, but also of socially constructed system play out in terms of creating an urban environment that we do perceive basically based on the position of the street walker, of the person passing the public space. And just to end that, I give you 2 quotes. The one is this, which says much more refined what I just tried to tell you, that the cities are sites of assemblage and multiplicity. These urban outcomes as emergent from multiple overlapping, intersecting processing in events. That's what I tried to make clear with this one picture. On this basis, we can identify different cities, or what they can kind of, what they have to say for the other city. And that goes very well with lots of geographers that also challenge the fact that the city is only, rather much more, is only more than architecture, so building and stones. And I say, no, it's about rhizomatic webs, it's about geographies of temporality, it's about many things that actually, at least yet, we can't reproduce in maps. And that gives us a kind of the basic question about, if we are talking about urban environments, about rural environments, we are so much dependent on maps that in the end, maybe it's a kind of a systematic flaw of our profession that leads us to miss some very important parts that I hope to make clear with my walks for the urban environments. So, finally, I'm at the end. I thank you very much for this intense attention and that you have letting me speak for so long, and hope you enjoyed it and gave you some little ideas that you might use for the workshop later. Thanks a lot.